Hello, this is Chelsea Dade, founder of Communicate for Health Justice LLC, and welcome to CFHJ's Soft Launching Justice podcast. Soft Launching Justice is a podcast exploring how young people of promise are shaping the future today by demanding more. Hosted by yours truly, each episode unpacks the systems youth are influencing and challenging today, from digital culture and public policy to workforce and leadership pathways. Through real conversations, this podcast holds space for emerging advocates who are leading boldly while challenging norms, even if we're all still figuring it out together. Subscribe to the podcast on YouTube at CFHJ. Well, welcome everyone to this month's episode of Soft Launching Justice. I'm Chelsea Dade, founder of Communicate for Health Justice LLC, or CFHJ for short. CFHJ is a youth workforce development hub and consultancy. Our services include professional writing, campaign development, and content creation, and we deliver tailored youth programs on the most important skill, communication, that centers youth of promise as factors in their health. This month's episode is titled The Language of Care. We're discussing how the language about youth shapes the way young people are viewed in our society. According to Tufts Center for Information and Research on Civic Learning and Engagement, stories about young people are disproportionately missing from traditional news. And the stories that are published about youth often feature negative stereotypes, presenting young people as dangerous, morally corrupt, and violent. In addition, stories about young people make up almost half of news coverage of violence, even though violence against youth is more frequent than violence perpetrated by youth. Reporting about violence is also highly racialized, with Black and Latino youth being disproportionately presented as perpetrators and white people as victims. My guest today is Darrell Frazier, a Gen Z leader and youth justice advocate. Thanks for being here, Darrell.
Thank you so much for having me, Chelsea. I'm excited to be here to have this very thoughtful and meaningful conversation with you.
Amazing. Well, I'm so glad you're here and here for this really important topic around language and framing. And so we'll go ahead and jump right on in. So, our first question is, the language used in media and public conversations about youth can either humanize or stigmatize them. Given the work you do in the youth justice space, what are some common narratives or phrases you think are harmful, and what language should we be using instead to better reflect care and possibility?
Yes, I really appreciate the question and the intention around it. And I think that this is a great way to kick off our conversation and just get grounded. Is just really in like the language that we use day to day. It's something that I think about constantly because language is never really neutral. It either opens up a door or closes one. And so when we use terms like juvenile delinquent or youth offender or even at-risk youth, we're really placing like the problem inside of a child and that something is wrong with them or that we're framing them as young people everywhere have something that is, violent or aggressive about them, whether they are in the courtrooms, in the classrooms, even into the way that some teachers look at them on their first day of school when we place terms and use phrases such as that. One phrase that really comes to mind that I would love to see get retired or just not used at all, that's commonly used, is at-risk youth. Because when we say a young person is at risk, we're locating the danger inside of that young person, when really what we mean or what we should be saying is that they are living in an environment that has not protected them, whether that's like unfunded schools, housing instability, exposure to violence, community disinvestment, and the list goes on. Those are the risks, not the child. So instead, I try to use language like young people impacted by the system, or youth with unmet needs, or simply young people who deserve more than what they've been given. And I think that what we also have to be honest about is that harmful language doesn't just live in the news headlines that we see or in the media. It lives also in how we write our policy memos and in the case files, in the way that probation officer describes a kid in a report. That language shapes what we believe is possible for someone. And if we already decided through the words we choose that a young person is a problem to be managed rather than a person to be supported, then our interventions are going to reflect that. And I think that's what we've seen in the last couple of years. And so when we change the language, we also change what solutions feel like and what is possible for those young people.
I love that. What an amazing way to kick off this conversation. So, We ask this question to all of our guests. So, how do you define health justice for young people right now? And what feels most urgent given the current social and political climate?
I love, 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 love this question. Especially myself being a young person who had to navigate the system as well, and also looking for resources that supported me. And that was a challenge within itself. I think it's very critical that we speak about this and talk about this and, explain what it actually means. So, I want to take a moment to just, think about this answer because I really want to make sure that I am clear and that folks hear me as I am speaking. But for me, I would say that health justice for young people means the right to be whole, not just the absence of like sickness, but the presence of dignity and opportunity and safety. It means that where you were born or what you look like or whether you've been touched by the system doesn't determine where you get to live a healthy, full life. And right now, given everything that's happened politically and socially, what feels most urgent to me is we have to stop treating young people's pain as a behavior problem. When young people act out or when they shut down, fight back, run away, or whatever have you, that is not a character flaw. It's a signal. It's a cry out for help. It's a cry out that something in their environment has failed them. And we need to be asking what kind of support can we provide to this young person or what kind of support do they need rather than asking like what is wrong with them. So health justice means building systems that are actually designed to answer that actual question. It means mental health support that is culturally responsive and accessible. It means schools that heal rather than punish. And it also means communities that are resourced enough to be able to help young people, hold them accountable, but still help young people and provide them with the resources that they need in order to thrive and do well. So if I had to like kind of sum all of this up, health justice for young people is the belief that every young person deserves to thrive and the commitment to building that community, that space, just a world where they can actually do that and that is possible as well.
Thank you so much for that answer. And I 100% agree. So, in terms of adultification and perception, you spoke a little bit about this, but we can continue talking more about this. Adultification bias often shapes how young people, especially young people of color, are perceived and treated in institutions and in the media. From your perspective as a youth advocate, how does this show up in the narratives we hear about youth? And what impact does it have on their health and opportunities?
Yes, I did touch on this just a little bit, but I would love to just dive deeper so that we can really get into the nitty gritty of explaining what adultification is, explicitly adultification bias. And so adultification bias is one of those things that once you see it, you really can't not like unsee it. For anyone who may not be familiar with the term, adultification is when young people, particularly Black youth and other children of color, are perceived as older or less innocent or less in need of protection than their white peers. And this isn't just like a feeling or an impression. There's research that documents this happening as early as the age of 5. That's 5 years old. So, in practice, it's that for example, a young Black girl who is crying is seen as dramatic rather than distressed, or a young African American boy who is scared is is read as threatening rather than just being afraid. And those misreadings can have enormous consequences. And it has had enormous consequences, as we can see in the state of where we are right now within our youth justice system. In the institutions that I have worked in previously and that I get to navigate around now, being whether that's schools or courtrooms or in the capital of that state, I see adultification show up in a language where people use to describe young people. Words like manipulative or aggressive a lot can cause. These aren't like neutral, like clinical observations or terms that are used. They're judgments that are deeply shaped by race, gender, class. And once those labels are placed or attached to like young people, they are incredibly hard to shake. So the health impact is real and it's very serious when it comes to young people because it impacts their trust with institutions, because those institutions have repeatedly misread them and or punished them. They stop seeking care, and that care is crucial. is needed for them. And so they learn to stop asking for help. They start to think that it's dangerous and or inappropriate. And that kind of institutional distrust doesn't just affect like one doctor's visit. It shapes a lifetime of relationship with health and healing and understanding what that is and how it can really benefit them. And I think the deepest harm of adultification is it robs young people of the grace to grow. And every young person is supposed to be able to make mistakes. That's literally what
Exactly.
adolescence is for and what it's about. But adultification means that far too many young people, especially young people of color, one mistakes become a permanent identity. They're looked at as criminals for the rest of their, and you don't get to just be a kid who made a bad decision anymore. You become a bad kid. And that distinction matters because most young people, once you have labeled them with those terms, it kind of becomes them. They act on it. So it's just important to be mindful about the language that we're using, how we talk about young people, and how we treat young people.
Definitely. Thank you so much for that answer. And yeah, I think it's about being mindful of how we are interacting with young people because the words and the way that we are treating them can have a lasting impact. So we also never know what they're going through, and so just always being mindful of that is super important.
So important.
So yes, so to close us out here, for people working in youth justice, what practices, whether in storytelling, media engagement, or everyday conversations, help move us toward a more just and youth centered approach?
This is an important question because it helps us be more constructive rather than, basically we can talk more about what's actually working rather than just talking about what's broken within the system. And so the first thing that I'll say is storytelling with young people. Storytelling, talking, not just like having young people talk, but also not just about them. Like there's a huge difference between organizations or entities that tell stories on behalf of young people and one that creates space for young people to tell their own stories in their own words, with their own framing. And I think this is so important. It's something that I had to learn over time because I had been a victim of tokenism when it comes to sharing my story and how I share my story. And when young people are the co-authors of their own narrative, the story changes. The complexity comes through, the humanity comes through, and you don't just stop getting like tragic youth stories, you start getting more like truth out of what those young people have experienced and what they've gone through and what they need. The second thing that I would say is we have to challenge what I call the exception framing. And that means simply those stories that lead with the against all odds, this young person overcame this in order to become this. That framing in itself, when it's well intentioned, still centers trauma. It says that the default expectation was failure. What if instead we talked about what was present in that young person's life? A mentor who showed up, rather it be a program that gave them room to breathe, a community that refused to give up on them. Similar to my own story, I have been fortunate enough to have people in my life who were mentors, who poured into me, and who gave me the opportunities and the resources that I need in order to thrive, although I made mistakes while during my adolescence. Third, I would say that this is something that I honestly try to really uphold in my own work is really holding institutions accountable in the language that they use. And although this is really hard because we work in a system that has utilized terms such as juvenile, which I cannot stand, but it has become so common and it had gotten so used to the term that it's the more formal professional legal term that they use. And so, instead of saying that, a young person failed to graduate, we can say that, the system failed to retain them or, a young person who ended up in the justice system. We can ask for, well, what pathways led them there or who built those pathways that, caused them to end up in this predicament? Because let's be honest, these systems are operating as they were created to. They're doing exactly the job that they're supposed to do. So I just want to be very clear about that. And then just finally, I would say, normalize like youth expertise. And I say this to young people all the time, that their experience is expertise. And that no matter where they go in life and whatever rooms or spaces that they're in, as they are speaking up, whether, they're talking about their own story, just like their experience in general. They are experts in that space. And so when we treat them as partners in research and advocacy and media and or policy conversations, we get better outcomes, not just more equitable outcomes, but more effective ones, because young people tend to, when they had the opportunity to talk about what their clay experience was, they can create better, more effective, and more clear policy solutions, and solutions that institutions and programs can be able to implement as well. And I think that, in addition, it ties all of this together is the intentionality. Like, none of this happens by accidents. And I think rewriting the narrative requires us to kind of like just reflect and slow down. And uh, instead of assumptions, we make deliberate choices about whose voice is centered and whose stories get told. When we do that work, every conversation, no matter what, becomes an act of advocacy. And I think that's way more important rather than just using the same status quo or the same type of narrative headlines that's just going to gain attention, but that's not truly developing concrete solutions in the spaces that we're trying to advocate in, or that we're trying to create change and impact.
Definitely. And, a few things stood out from what you shared. And there is a difference between an organization kind of creating a narrative for youth and the youth actually sharing their own narrative. I see that. I see the first a lot. And so I appreciate you making that distinction. Um, well, that's the end of our questions. I really appreciate you being on Soft Launching Justice, Daryl. I think a lot of folks will gain so much insight and wisdom from your thoughts and your experience and your leadership in this space. So just thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. And thank you for the platform. I love the fact that we are having this timely and much needed conversation. I think it's important, especially right now, like we said it before earlier in our conversation, with just like the social and political climate that's happening right now. There's a lot of fear mongering in communities to kind of, create this image that young people are violent and like youth crime is increasing. And in actuality, the data shows and reflects that, youth crime has actually decreased over years since the pandemic, and that the types of crime has also changed as well. And I think that when we shift the narrative again about, instead of, youth being criminals or youth doing bad things, and instead, talk about what it is exactly that's working and what young people need, I think that we make progress, right? Because as time will move forward, there's always going to be support and resources that are needed on behalf of young people who don't have access to it. And so they deserve to really have an opportunity to be able to thrive and take advantage of those opportunities just like any of their other peers.
100%. I agree 100%. Well, thank you so very much for being on the podcast again. And thanks to our listeners. Make sure you continue to follow CFHJ on YouTube for more updates. Take care, everybody. Thank you for listening to CFHJ's Soft Launching Justice podcast. We hope today's conversation gave you something to think about and something to act on. Today, young people need support more than ever. Their autonomy and well-being are being challenged by cuts to critical social services like SNAP and housing, while education and early career pathways are increasingly uncertain as entry-level opportunities disappear from the economy. It's up to all generations to respond with compassion and intention as we consider how to support the next generation. And it starts with using language with care. If this episode resonated with you, take a moment to share it, leave a review, or send it to someone who believes in youth voice and health justice. That's how this community grows. If you would like to be a guest on the podcast, you can learn more about joining us at cfhj.org and on social media at CFHJ. Until next time, keep asking questions, keep pushing for justice, and keep communicating.